So if
Saturday
we follow
mornings are
this plan,
supposed to be
we should see
gentle,
results.
even a
That
little
makes
lazy.
sense.
The sort of time
not
when
so sure
coffee
about this
brews
part.
slowly and one
Let's think it
savors the
through.
quiet hum of nature instead of
Possible.
email
So the
notifications
main
or
takeaway
neighborly
here
drama.
is to ensure our Q3
Yet for Colby, the
projections
calm
align with the
dissolved the
new
moment a
marketing
thin
strategy.
white envelope
So
appeared
if we
under his
follow this
cabin
plan,
door.
we should see results.
Its wording
That
was
makes
as
sense.
absurd as it was shocking.
I'm not so
Sell
sure
your
about this
cabin in
part.
48 hours
Let's
or
think it
else.
through.
So you
The letter
see,
carried the air of a
property
bad movie
line
villain's
clearly
ultimatum.
extends to that old
Except
oak
this
tree.
wasn't fiction.
I see
It was
now.
a demand
That makes
signed by
sense.
Denise Benson,
So you see,
the president of the local
property line
homeowners
clearly
association,
extends to that old oak
who
tree.
seemed to think she had authority
I
to
see it
order
now.
residents
That
around
makes
like
sense.
pieces on her personal chessboard. Instead of greeting the morning with birdsong, Colby found himself staring at a paper filled with threats of legal action if he didn't sell his home within 2 short days. The contradiction between the silliness of the threat and the seriousness of its implication left him half laughing, half appalled. Was this harassment? Or had he suddenly slipped into a parallel universe where neighborhood presidents declared martial law? At first glance, one might think panic would set in. After all, the threat was bold, loud, and delivered at an hour when rational thinking tends to lag behind caffeine. But Colby carried a special advantage. His 2 decades of experience in insurance had taught him the fundamentals of real estate and property law. This wasn't his first time reading intimidating paperwork designed to scare someone into compliance. He could almost see the fatal flaws bleeding through the letter in bold ink. In Michigan, as in nearly every state, HOA boards do not hold power to seize or sell private property. They can levy fines, file complaints, or ask a court to enforce community rules. But demanding a resident to sell within 48 hours was legally impossible. For Colby, this meant the letter didn't only lack enforceability, it was harassment in black and white. Suspicion sharpened into clarity as he retrieved an old wooden box from his closet. Inside waited a carefully guarded trove of important documents, papers he had collected and safeguarded precisely for moments like this. Among them sat the easement agreement for the power line corridor that passed under his property. This agreement was crucial, granting the HOA rights to run utility lines through the land but with very strict boundaries. The allowance was for residential service only. The margin notes and subsections whispered reminders of protective clauses like loyal allies. Section 12, subsection B. Any for-profit activity requires reclassification and adjusted rates. As Colby reread those lines, the absurdity of Denise's intimidation became crystal clear. Not only was her threat unlawful, but her recent projects with the HOA might have already put the association itself in jeopardy. The EV chargers installed at the marina, accessible to outsiders swiping credit cards, likely constituted illegal commercial usage under the easement. In attempting to control Colby with a fake ultimatum, Denise had accidentally stirred the memory of the very clause that could flip the tables against her board. Still, emotions simmered beneath the law books and paperwork. There was a sting that came with being treated like a chess pawn in one's own home. No resident wants to imagine being tossed to the curb by a threatening slip of paper, especially when that home represents safety and stability. The psychological pressure was obvious. Letters like these aimed to scare ordinary people, especially older residents, into compliance without questioning legality. Colby realized that if Denise had the audacity to serve him such a notice, chances were high that others in the community had received similar treatment. The laugh he'd forced out earlier wasn't amusement, but something closer to disbelief wrapped in outrage. Was he really reading a piece of paper that threatened to uproot his life? Simply because the HOA president willed it so? The sheer boldness of Denise's actions pushed Colby past the initial urge to dismiss the letter as nonsense. Dismissing it would be the easy choice, crumple it and move on. But experience reminded him that bullies thrive on silence. Letting such an outrageous directive go unchecked could encourage more harassment, not only for him but for any neighbor unwilling or unable to challenge the letterhead. That thought shifted the situation from a personal affront to a broader pattern of abuse. He wasn't just fighting for his cabin. He was standing up against a dangerous precedent. By the end of that same morning, Colby's kitchen table had transformed into a legal war room. Stacks of documents formed neat battlements, easement agreements sat like shields, and detailed notes became weapons sharpened with clarity. The 48-hour deadline wasn't a legitimate ticking clock. It was a smokescreen. Ironically, instead of cornering Colby, The notice had handed him the spark he needed to expose far larger violations lying beneath the surface of community management. He realized the true weight of the ultimatum. It was less about his property and more about power. Power misused, misrepresented, and unchecked. That was the beginning. What looked like a threat to strip him of his home became the launchpad for resistance. Colby's refusal to crumble under Denise's letter wasn't just about legal literacy. It was about courage tempered by knowledge. While Denise tried to play power games with paper notices, Colby armed himself with documentation, critical thinking, and resolve. In that moment, he understood what the HOA president hadn't anticipated. When you threaten the wrong person, especially one who can read fine print and spot fraud at 20 paces, you don't trigger compliance, you ignite defiance. And with that, the board's first strike against Colby had already backfired, setting the stage for the unraveling of all their reckless schemes. The thin white ultimatum had already lit a fire in Colby's mind, but the true turning point came when his suspicions about the HOA's misuse of the easement corridor began to harden into undeniable reality. He wasn't content to simply dismiss the phony 48-hour sale notice. Instead, he wanted proof that Denise and her allies weren't just overstepping. They were exploiting the community under the guise of authority. And Colby wasn't alone in this mission. Just a few cabins down lived Harris, a seasoned electrician known for his sharp eyes, steady hands, and an old but dependable film camera he carried everywhere like a badge of honor. If anyone could confirm or debunk the whispers about illegal power configurations, it was Harris. That morning, Colby handed him the ultimatum letter without a word. Harris read the contents, whistled low, and shook his head. His reaction said it all. This wasn't normal, wasn't legal, and wasn't enforceable. But when Colby laid out the easement document, pointing to the clear prohibition against for-profit activities, Harris's expression shifted from casual disapproval to genuine concern. The old electrician had already noticed something peculiar during his walks near the marina. Tourists swiping credit cards at the electric vehicle chargers installed only weeks earlier. That memory clicked into focus now. If charging outsiders money for community power wasn't commercial use, then nothing was. The suspicion was no longer theoretical. It was begging to be tested. Without hesitating, Colby grabbed his jacket, tucked the easement document under his arm like a shield, and marched with Harris down the gravel path toward the marina. The walk itself carried symbolic weight, the crunch of their boots against the stones matching the rising rhythm of resolve in Colby's chest. When they arrived, the marina looked ordinary on the surface. Wooden docks rested quietly against the water. Boats rocked lazily, and the faint smell of fuel and lake air mingled in the wind. But what stood out were the gleaming, brand-new charging stations lined up at the edge of the lot. Far from subtle, the chargers screamed for attention, painted sleek white and mounted with bright digital kiosks. A sign announced proudly, "Marina Charging Stations, Public Access." That single phrase was the smoking gun. Colby's eyes landed on a crucial detail: a timer box, rigged to automatically switch the chargers into public mode overnight and back into private mode in the morning. It was a little trick, almost clever if it weren't so blatantly illegal. The system essentially allowed the HOA to double dip, pretending the stations were for residents in the day, while secretly running a commercial operation at night for paying tourists. Colby pulled out his phone and began snapping photographs while Harris, in his professional stride, documented every panel, timer, and cable. What had started as a gut feeling was quickly transforming into a solid case, dressed in photographic evidence. Things escalated when Harris unpacked his tools to measure load readings. The digital screen all but shouted, these lines weren't pulling the kind of current typical of residential utilities. They were running at business-level usage, higher, consistent, and programmed to handle transactions around the clock. As Harris explained the readings, Colby caught every number and explanation on video. He wasn't just compiling facts. He was building a shield, one document and one clip at a time, against the arbitrary power of Denise's board. Predictably, their evidence gathering wasn't welcomed. A bulky security guard appeared, boots crunching like a warning drum, and demanded they leave. Harris, calm as ever, didn't even flinch. He raised his licensed electrician's credentials and declared they were performing a state-permitted safety inspection. That phrase cut through the guard's bluster like steel through cloth, forcing him to retreat after a tense pause. To Colby, The exchange highlighted just how much the HOA relied on intimidation over legality. It was their pattern. Scare first, hope nobody questioned later. But now, their tactics were colliding head-on with people who both questioned and documented. The deeper they looked, the more damning the discoveries became. Hidden menus on the payment kiosks revealed dozens, then hundreds of transactions processed in just 2 weeks. Each transaction was another nail in the coffin, proving not just that business occurred, but that it was systematic, frequent, and intentional. Harris even printed logs using his portable device, pages spitting out with the steady rhythm of a typewriter sealing fate. By the time the printer finished, the stack of receipts resembled a financial diary of fraud. For Colby, standing there watching neighbors' rights being siphoned for tourist money, a mixture of outrage and grim satisfaction filled him. Outrage at Denise and her board for twisting a resident's easement into a money machine, but satisfaction that the truth was no longer hidden and unprovable. The evidence was undeniable, tangible, and utterly lethal from a legal standpoint. Even worse for the HOA, the retroactive costs of reclassification, commercial rates 3 times higher than residential, meant that their little revenue stream was poised to backfire spectacularly. By the time Colby returned to his cabin, his kitchen table was covered with photos, load readings, payments logs, and contract clauses. What started with a ridiculous 48-hour threat had unlocked something larger, a paper trail proving Denise's greed, deception, and abuse of authority. The false ultimatum had been their opening move, but discovery of the marina's commercial misuse was Colby's counterstrike, and it wasn't just stronger, it was devastating. What Denise had dismissed as a bluffing tactic had unleashed the one force she couldn't intimidate: documentation. And from documentation, Colby knew, the dominoes of justice would inevitably begin to fall. By the time Colby had finished assembling his growing mountain of evidence, the absurdity of Denise's original ultimatum had transformed into something far more dangerous for the HOA than they realized. His kitchen table looked more like a courtroom bench, photos of timers and kiosks scattered across one side, easement papers marked with fluorescent highlighters on another, and transaction logs stacked like ammunition ready to fire. All of it pointed to one conclusion. While Denise pretended to play queen of the neighborhood, she had unwittingly exposed the HOA to crippling legal and financial consequences. The question wasn't if the violations could be proven, it was how long Denise could pretend to deny them. When Colby arrived at the clubhouse that afternoon, he didn't come with a panicked frown or a trembling voice. He came with the steely calm of a man holding a royal flush at a poker table. The rustic wooden doors creaked as he entered. The smell of varnish and dust clung to the air, as though even the building itself bore the weight of years of politicking and bad decisions. At the head of the long table sat Denise Benson, armored in her position as HOA president and gripping her clipboard as though it could shield her from accountability. Next to her was Trevor Holt, the HOA treasurer, hunched nervously over a ledger, wiping his brow before the meeting had even properly begun. "Colby," Denise began in a tone dripping with politeness that felt as genuine as plastic silverware. "Thank you for coming. We need to discuss your property situation." Her composure lasted exactly 3 seconds before Colby slid the original ultimatum across the table. "Actually, Denise, we need to discuss your legal situation." Trevor's knee bounced so nervously under the table that his ledger rattled. Denise, unamused, straightened her shoulders. "Excuse me?" she said, trying to reclaim her authority. "You signed a notice demanding my home be sold in 2 days," Colby replied, his voice steady. "But Michigan law doesn't grant HOA presidents power to force property sales. What you issued isn't enforcement, it's harassment." Denise's grip tightened on her clipboard until her knuckles blanched. Trevor coughed and shuffled papers, unwilling to meet Colby's eyes. Seeing his opportunity, Colby continued. He carefully laid down the easement agreement, tapping the clause banning for-profit activity on utility lines. Then came the photographs, shiny kiosks displaying public access signs, the timer box wired to flip into commercial use each night, and handwritten logs of tourists' credit card transactions. He spread them in an arc across the table like a magician revealing cards. "This," he said firmly, "is the reality of your so-called improvements." Trevor hesitated, then reached for one of the transaction logs. His face drained of color the moment he processed the printout. Over 200 separate transactions in 2 weeks. As treasurer, he didn't need Colby to explain what that meant. He understood the liability before the word was even spoken. "Denise," he began softly, but she cut him off with a dismissive hand, her voice high and cracking. "Those are minor charges, hardly commercial." Colby shook his head, pulling out his phone. "Let's hear it from someone who lives and breathes insurance." He dialed, then put the call on speaker. Sarah, his old contact from Midwest Property Insurance, answered warmly, before shifting into professional clarity as Colby explained the scenario. "Sarah," he asked plainly, "if an HOA operates commercial activity while insured as residential, what happens to their coverage?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "The policy is void instantly. Coverage is retroactively canceled from the first day of commercial activity. Board members become personally liable." The words dropped like a hammer. Trevor inhaled sharply. Denise stiffened, but her silence betrayed the truth. She had no rebuttal. The facade of authority she clung to began to fracture under the combined weight of legal contracts, photographic evidence, and an insurance professional speaking through speakerphone louder than any gavel. What Denise still failed to grasp, however, was that the problem no longer lay in one angry resident challenging her notice. The issue had become a systemic one. Colby leaned forward, his voice low but steady enough to slice through the room. "Your board has been uncovered. You're not just bending rules for convenience. You're exposing this entire community to lawsuits, rate hikes, and financial ruin, and every threat you send only deepens your liability." Trevor placed his hands flat against the table as sweat pooled on his brow. It was obvious his loyalty to Denise had snapped. He wasn't a hardened schemer like her. He was a bookkeeper caught on the wrong side of someone else's arrogance. Guilt crept across his face as he flipped through his ledger, the quiet realization dawning that he too was now implicated. Denise clung tighter to her flimsy shield of indignation. "You're just stirring trouble, Colby. You can't scare us with fine print." Colby gathered the documents, then pointed calmly at the spread of proof. "You sent me a fake ultimatum. I responded with the law. You tried intimidation. I countered with documentation. If you think that's trouble, wait until the inspectors arrive." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Trevor sat pale and blank, caught between whispering conscience and loud consequences. Denise's facade cracked into more than frustration. It twisted into desperation. For the first time in years, she realized the boardroom no longer belonged to her. Her clipboard, her titles, her threats, they were powerless in the face of truth. Colby didn't linger to savor the moment. He gathered his folder, rose smoothly, and turned for the door. "You wanted to enforce authority with fear, Denise," he said without glancing back. "But authority without legality isn't power. It's harassment. And this time, the law is on my side." When the heavy clubhouse doors closed behind him, Colby knew the tide had shifted. The HOA's intimidation campaign had started with one man alone at his kitchen table, but now it cracked open the awareness that every resident had been a target too. Denise's control had worked only because no one before had dared to lay out the facts. That day at the clubhouse marked the end of her one-sided reign, and the beginning of a fight backed not by fear, but by law and collective defiance. The confrontation at the clubhouse should have been the moment of reckoning. A rational leader, faced with undeniable transaction logs, binding easement clauses, and an insurance professional spelling doom over speakerphone, would have paused, perhaps even admitted defeat and retreated. But rationality had long since abandoned Denise Benson. Instead, the humiliation of being cornered lit a fire of desperation that pushed her beyond intimidation into something far riskier. When fear of losing control grips the wrong kind of person, boundaries crumble, and rules become inconveniences to be torn apart. The first crack in her restraint appeared after midnight, when Colby's phone buzzed with a warning from his cabin's security system. Motion detected near the utility corridor. Through the kitchen window, beams of the moon illuminated a hunched silhouette crouched beside the buried junction box, wire cutters glinting faintly in the dark. At first, Colby assumed it must be a rogue contractor or an unlucky worker sent without notice, but as the figure stood, the outline of Denise became unmistakable. The HOA president herself, clad in dark clothes, was fumbling with live wiring like a burglar caught in the glow of her own recklessness. Her actions weren't symbolic, they were sabotage. Colby knew enough about electricity to understand what she was risking. The ground wires she yanked and the live connections she clawed at weren't just neighborhood property. They were arteries of energy that powered every home, every oxygen concentrator, every fridge humming in the night. One clumsy cut could plunge the community into blackout, spark a fire, or worse, fry equipment that residents depended on to stay alive. The image of elderly Mrs. Patterson's oxygen machine haunted Colby as he reached for his phone and called Harris. "She's cutting the lines," he whispered urgently. Harris arrived within minutes, camera ready, and began documenting the hurricane of insanity unfolding in front of them. Sparks hissed and alarms triggered as Denise's meddling tripped the utility company's safety grid. Sirens roared across the night like an angry choir, and red strobes pulsed through the trees, waking neighbors one after another. Dogs began barking. Doors swung open, and residents stumbled onto porches in half-awake disbelief. What should have been the quiet hours of early morning now rang with chaos. And at the epicenter of it all was Denise, crouched with cutters in her hand, frozen in panic as high-visibility emergency trucks screamed down the road. The utility technicians leapt out dressed in reflective jackets and carrying insulated tools, their professional urgency radiating authority. They saw the mess instantly. Ground wires severed, voltage lines half-cut, junction covers torn away. Their verdict was swift and brutal. "This is felony sabotage," one barked as he ordered her to step away. Harris handed over photographs as evidence, while Colby's security video captured every incriminating moment. A sheriff's cruiser soon followed, its headlights washing over the stunned faces of neighbors gathering at the tree line. Denise didn't protest innocence. She could only stammer excuses about being just an HOA president checking connections. The technician actually laughed. "Checking connections? Ma'am, HOA presidents don't have any authority over electrical infrastructure. You put this whole block at risk." Her arrest in flashing lights turned what had been whispers of doubt into undeniable proof. Denise hadn't just broken trust, she had broken the law. But even the spectacle of her first arrest couldn't contain her spiral. Fueled by rage, humiliation, and an unwillingness to let go, Denise doubled down once released on bail. Her new tactic was more disturbing than cutting wires. She began weaponizing fear against the vulnerable. Among her targets, none was more shocking than Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow battling fragile health. Colby's heart sank when Mrs. Patterson arrived at his cabin, clutching a trembling notice. Unlike the bogus sale demands, this paper dripped with cruelty. It threatened to terminate her utility service and explicitly dismissed exemptions for medical equipment. In other words, Denise's board was attempting to leverage her very lifeline, the oxygen concentrator that kept her alive at night, as a tool of coercion. Reading the words aloud turned Colby's stomach. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was endangerment. Cutting or even threatening to cut power to essential medical equipment in Michigan doesn't just cross a line. It tramples it into criminal territory. In legal language, it was no less than reckless endangerment of life, with federal disability protections ready to descend. In human language, it was monstrous. For Colby, the moment solidified his resolve. He called the sheriff immediately, reporting the blatant threat against an elderly woman's medical device. Detective Morrison, hearing the details, didn't hesitate. What Denise had done was chargeable as elder endangerment and potentially even attempted assault through deprivation of essential utilities. As neighbors gathered around Mrs. Patterson's cabin, outrage reached collective boiling point. These were no longer isolated grievances. Harris revealed photographs of residential-only permits dating back decades. Jim, the retired teacher, pulled up state statutes, and more residents came forward with notices of their own. The picture became clear. Denise's harassment campaign was deliberate, targeted especially at the weakest. The intimidation that once divided households now united them. For the first time, fear shifted sides. Meanwhile, Denise's reckless campaign was digging her hole deeper with law enforcement. Tampering with live electrical lines was already a felony, but combining that with medical endangerment turned her personal vendetta into a multi-jurisdictional storm. State compliance officers, insurance agents, and now even federal disability rights investigators began preparing cases. And still, Denise did not relent. She barked at contractors to destroy evidence at the marina, but they refused, citing prison over paychecks. Every move she made only tightened the noose around her own control. What started as a ridiculous notice demanding Colby sell his cabin had now escalated into full-blown criminal chaos. The HOA president had gone from paper harassment to wire cutters, from phony legal language to direct threats on life-sustaining machines. It was no longer a neighborhood disagreement. It was the unraveling of a tyrant who mistook power for law, and who, in her desperation, managed to transform her own bluff into the foundation of a criminal case that no defense clipboard could ever withstand. By Friday morning, the neighborhood no longer resembled a quiet lakeside retreat. The hum of boat motors and chirping finches had been replaced by the low rumble of official convoys, their headlights piercing morning fog as they crawled down the main road like a parade no one had requested, but everyone secretly hoped would arrive. State utility inspectors, insurance investigators, federal disability rights officials, sheriff's cruisers. Each vehicle that pulled in represented another layer of accountability, forming around Denise Benson and her collapsing empire. For years she had run the HOA as though it were her throne. Today it became her courtroom. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, children pressed noses against frosted windows, and adults shuffled onto porches with steaming mugs to witness the unthinkable. Teams of professionals, badges flashing, clipboards in hand, descending on the marina and clubhouse like storm clouds rolling in with purpose. Justice, it turned out, didn't whisper. It arrived in uniforms, boots, and voices clipped with authority. Allison Brooks from State Utility Compliance took the lead, marching toward the marina's shiny but now silent charging stations with a thick folder tucked under one arm and a roll of bright yellow sticky notes under the other. Everywhere she walked, she labeled violations like a teacher grading a disastrously failed homework assignment. For 3 relentless hours, inspectors combed through every panel, kiosk, and underground line. Harris, the electrician neighbor turned star witness, guided them with precision. Together, they confirmed what Colby's evidence had already spelled out in bold. The HOA corridor was being abused for nonstop commercial activity. The reclassification was not just recommended, it was mandatory. When Brooks finally emerged with the official documents, her words cut sharp. Effective immediately, this utility corridor is reclassified to commercial service, retroactive to the first day of outside transactions. Months, even years of cheap residential rates had now transformed into staggering penalties. For every swiped credit card, every overnight timer, Denise's board had invited thousands of dollars in retroactive costs. The total landed like a hammer, over $23,000 owed for less than a month of operations and triple billing moving forward. Colby couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Their attempt to squeeze profit from the community had backfired into financial ruin. Next came Sarah and her team from the insurance company. Briefcases opened, documents spread, and Colby's speakerphone call from days earlier now played out in binding ink. Operating commercial ventures under residential coverage wasn't a mistake or oversight. It was insurance fraud. Policies were canceled retroactively, which meant 2 weeks of uncovered activity. 2 weeks during which the board had legally exposed not just the HOA but themselves personally. Trevor Holt, the treasurer who once trembled behind his ledger, stood contrite, now willingly handing the very books he once protected. His weary eyes betrayed both regret and resignation. The checks he had signed, once obedient acts of loyalty, had become incriminating trails of Denise's harassment fund. Security guards, investigators, and intimidation campaigns had been paid from the community's own pocket. "She made us complicit," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "But I won't hide this any longer." Then came the sharpest blow of all. Detective Morrison reading the arrest warrants. Denise Benson sat slumped in the clubhouse, her once rigid posture now crumbling under the weight of printed accusations. "Denise Benson," Morrison said evenly, "you are under arrest for harassment, utility sabotage, elder endangerment, evidence tampering, insurance fraud, and criminal misrepresentation." When federal disability rights officers stepped forward to add federal charges related to Mrs. Patterson's life-sustaining equipment, Denise's attorney visibly paled. This was no longer a neighborhood tiff or even a civil squabble. It was felony after felony stacking into a mountain she could no longer climb. Neighbors watched in stunned silence, some recording quietly on their phones. For years they had endured her threats in isolation. Now they saw the same woman, cuffed and led out by deputies, her power reduced to the sound of gravel crunching under boots and the steady slam of a cruiser door shutting her rain closed. What followed was a catharsis the community didn't know it had craved for so long. A vote was held on the spot, unanimous and almost furious in its urgency, to strip Denise of all board positions and bar her permanently from service. The motion carried not with polite hand raises but with people slapping ballots down as though driving nails into her coffin of authority. Mrs. Patterson, her oxygen machine humming faithfully beside her, stood with surprising strength as she addressed the room. She recounted the threats, the terror, and the humiliation of being told her medical equipment could be used as leverage. Her words cracked the room open, applause erupting not out of politeness but out of relief and vindication. For the first time, silence didn't belong to fear. It belonged to victory. By late afternoon, the officials departed one by one, leaving behind a trail of taped notices, seized evidence, and signed orders. The marina chargers were dark, sealed with tags warning of evidence preservation. The clubhouse was no longer a hub of power but a crime scene under investigation. And the HOA, once intimidating in its force of letters and fines, stood hollow with its insurance canceled, its electric rates tripled, and its president behind bars. Colby lingered at the bulletin board where the infamous 48-hour sale notice still fluttered weekly. Beside it, he pinned the official reclassification document, a golden ticket of poetic revenge. The absurdity of Denise's original bluff, her attempt to evict him on paper, was now eclipsed by the reality of her downfall. She had weaponized bureaucracy against neighbors thinking nobody would fight back, but once someone did, the very bureaucracies she abused became the battalions that dismantled her power. That night, Colby sat on his deck with Harris and Mrs. Patterson. The lake shimmered orange in the setting sun, and laughter came easier than it had in weeks. Harris joked about Denise's attempt to juggle chainsaws blindfolded with power lines, while Mrs. Patterson passed around warm cookies, her gratitude written in eyes less weary than before. For once, the neighborhood wasn't whispering in fear but chatting openly, plotting community repair instead of bracing for the next threat. In the end, Denise had tried to play queen with ultimatums and scare tactics. But she had forgotten one rule etched into both law and life: documents, truth, and solidarity outweigh intimidation. Her bluff was loud. Justice was louder. And amid the calm of that lakeside evening, the community finally knew what it meant to be safe again.